Okay, this is a video that we're going to be covering the functional anatomy, and I want to focus on the functional anatomy related to language acquisition, also language deficits. So the goal here is to review some of the structures that we've seen during the semester and see how they related to language, and then ultimately how it affects language deficits, and we'll look at some of the clinical correlations subsequently. So first, before we get into language processing, I want to talk about cortical asymmetries. By asymmetries, we mean that there are certain differences between the left and the right side of the brain as far as the overall functional or anatomical asymmetries here. And we're talking about that in 1968, Geschwin and Lewitsky did a study where they reported that the left planum temporal, and it's shown here on the right-hand side in your diagram, this is where they removed part of the frontal and the parietal lobes removed. And they looked and they found that in a large number of individuals, now these were post-mortem studies, that the left planum temporal was actually found to be larger than the right planum temporal. So that was their overall conclusion. So they found that again, that the left planum temporal was larger in 65% of the brains that they studied, again post-mortem. The right was larger in 11%, and in 24% of their brain study, they found no difference between the size of the left and the right planum temporal. Now, so what they found, again, that there were these cortical asymmetries, anatomical asymmetries. Since those studies in 1968, they've been shown that these cortical asymmetries actually occur prior to birth. So in fetuses at 24 weeks, these same cortical asymmetries are also noted. Although humans have the largest cortical asymmetries that have been found, other species have also found certain amount of cortical asymmetries, not as marked as those found in humans, but again, animals that use vocalization, some of the great apes, some of the songbirds, they've shown that the size of the left brain tends to be larger than the right brain. So this is something that's seen. From some of the records from fossils dating many, even occurring prior to the acquisition of language in humans. So again, if we look at the fossil history, they've also found from some of the records, from skulls, they found that it seemed like in these records that the left planum temporal was probably larger than the right. So these, again, these changes or these cortical asymmetries favoring the left lobe predate birth, and then also predate the fact that humans' use of language, which is estimated to be about 100,000 years ago. So we had anatomical asymmetries. Subsequently, there was also additional tests. Now they want to say, okay, the cortex is larger on the left side. How about the functional significance? It might be larger, but does this have an impact? And several studies were done. One primarily is here in the second paragraph here. You can see the WADA test. And the WADA test is a test where they give sodium amytal, which is a local anesthetic, to subjects. And what they do is they inject this sodium amytal in the left carotid artery. And we know that the left carotid artery primarily infuses or perfuses the left cortex. The right carotid artery, the blood flow goes primarily to the right cortex. So they were able to have patients awake talking while they injected into the left carotid artery and looked at what happened, and then they could also then study these individuals and find what happens when they inject into the right carotid artery, and in that way sort of anesthetize, if you wish, the right cortex. And what these tests, the WADA test, revealed was that the left hemisphere was the language hemisphere in 90% of subjects. And that was basically irrespective if these individuals were left or right-handed. What they've shown that at least in right-handed individuals, 96% of those subjects had their language in their left hemisphere. So that was for right-handed individuals. In left-handed individuals, they found that 70% of those individuals had their language in the left hemisphere. So again, the left hemisphere was the language hemisphere in a large or the majority of subjects studied. Okay, now let's talk about language and what do we mean by language. And as we basically come up with our sort of scenario for language deficits, language is a distinctly human form of communication. And what do we mean by distinctly human? And I think it's by the next three parameters. If you look at the language, normally we speak at a rate of about 180 words per minute. If you look at other forms of communication, it's extremely rapid. So again, about 180 words per minute that we actually speak. We have a mental dictionary of somewhere between 60,000 to 120,000 different words. So we have a large repertoire of different words with very different meanings that we can actually rely on. So we have this large dictionary, other forms of communication. I mean, you could wave your hands to get somebody's attention, but again, why are you waving? You want to say hello or whatever. The richness of that type of communication is very limited compared to language. And then lastly, the error rate is very low in language. There's approximately only 1 out of every million words we use is actually misused or mispronounced. So our error rate is extremely low for language as far as communication. So again, these are the three sort of parameters that really makes it extremely a distinctly human form, and other animals don't have such a large richness of their types of communication. Okay, language is distinctive from other forms of communication by 4 facets. Its creativity, its form, its content, and its use. First, what do we mean by creativity? Creativity is the fact that with every word we speak, we create new and original sentences. We're always being creative. So if you're, let's say, at the dinner table having a meal with a good friend, you don't rehearse what you're going to say. You're creative as the conversation moves on. It's flowing. You're creating as you're speaking. So that's the creativity. The second aspect is form. Form of language is where language makes infinite use of finite means. What do we mean by this? Infinite use of finite means. In the English language, for example, we have limited sounds. We have what are known as phonemes. We have 50 different sounds that we make in the English language. Through morphology, these 50 sounds are converted to approximately several million words. So again, the difference between cat and bat, there's just a slight difference as far as the sound, but we create a new word. So from these limited sounds, 50 of them, through morphology, we create several million different words. And from those several million words, we can create an infinite number of sentences through the use of grammar. So those words are basically put together, and again, the form of language, we have an infinite number of sentences that we can create through language. Next, we have content. What do we mean by content? Content is the meaning. There's also an emotional content, but the content is the actual meaning of the words. What are we trying to say? What are we trying to get across with those? And there's also an emotional content. And then finally, it's distinct in itself of use, and the use of language is a means of social communication. So we communicate, we use language as a means of social communication. Now, the note at the bottom is sort of significant here, and we're going to see this shortly, is that certain diseases interfere more with one than with another of these features. For example, form. If I go back to form now, form can be affected by diseases of the cerebellum, resulting in a dysarthria, an inability to articulate, or by lesions of the cerebral cortex, and we'll see it later on as Broca's aphasia. Content. Content can be affected in Wernicke's aphasia, and again, we'll see this shortly, in type of conduction aphasia, and then also in schizophrenia. So content is the meaning, so those could be disrupted in those diseases. Again, Wernicke's disease, conduction aphasia, or schizophrenia. And then finally, use can also be affected in aprosodias, and those are damages that we're going to see which occur in the non-dominant hemisphere. And also in schizophrenia, the use can be affected. So we do have these different clinical correlations. Now, just as a definition here, we have aphasias, and I've referred to several aphasias. Aphasias are disruptions in language that is cortical in origin. So here's where there's a lesion occurring in the cortex, and which disrupts language. That's called an aphasia. So again, a person who has a stroke in their language hemisphere will have an inability to articulate or an inability to understand. That's an aphasia. Contrast this to a dysarthria. A dysarthria is a disruption in language that is linked to disruption of a non-cortical region. So here we're talking about a disruption occurring outside the cortex. So a person who may have a cerebellar lesion may have problems coordinating the use of their vocal apparatus, and may be able to, would be stuttering, and that would have a language deficit. A person who had a broken jaw, a hockey player who gets his jaw broken during a hockey game, gets his jaw wired. At that point, he's very limited to those sounds he can make. So that is not a cortical lesion, it's a non-cortical. Again, it's the jaw that's affected, but nevertheless there's a language deficit, and that would be termed a dysarthria, because again, it's non-cortical in its origin. Okay, language processing. Now we're going to be using what's known as the Wernicke-Geschwind model for language processing. And I just want to define a few terms or just show the diagram that I'm going to be showing over and over again. And here we're looking at the left and right cortex from the above view. So again, if I sort of focus here on my diagram, I have my left cortex here, the right cortex, and I basically have points A, B, C, and D. Now for this model, we're going to assume that this represents a typical individual where the left hemisphere is the language hemisphere. So we're going to say the left hemisphere is the language hemisphere and the right hemisphere is the non-language hemisphere. And we're going to define A, B, C, and D. A is an area that we're going to call Broca's area. Broca's area is the operculum, and we're going to see the operculum shortly, in the language hemisphere. So Broca's area is a term we use specifically to define the operculum in the language hemisphere. Now there is a operculum in the non-language hemisphere. In this case here, this would be item C. So item C is the operculum in the non-language hemisphere, but we do not call it Broca's area. Now let's look at area B. Area B is in the language hemisphere, and this refers to as Wernicke's area. So this is Wernicke's area, which we'll see shortly where it's located. Again, it's in the language hemisphere. And you can see that there's an area here in the non-language hemisphere, area D, which is akin to Wernicke's area, but it's not called Wernicke's. So we have Broca's and Wernicke's in the language hemisphere, and then we have sort of anatomical correlates in the non-language hemisphere that would be referred to as the operculum on the right side, or the superior temporal gyrus. The distal third of the superior temporal gyrus would be the area we'd refer on the right hemisphere, and that area on the left would be called Wernicke's area. So using this in mind now, let's go and see how language is processed in the cortex. So again, here we just have an area that I've, just to go back to our anatomy here. And we can focus on this diagram. If you've seen this before, this was one of our first diagrams. So here we have the lateral sulcus. I'll basically draw this in red. So here's my lateral sulcus. And remember, and this will be make sense a little later on, the lateral sulcus, another term we used for it was the Sylvian fissure. So the lateral sulcus or the Sylvian fissure are the same areas. So we know that this area now that I'm going to sort of highlight here in green represents the superior temporal gyrus, and we said the distal third of that gyrus was Wernicke's area that I'll basically now highlight in blue. So this would be Wernicke's area in this diagram. The operculum is in the frontal cortex, and what I'm highlighting here in blue is the operculum, but since we're looking at the left hemisphere, this would be referred to as Broca's area, because again, we're looking at the left field, and then this here in the right-hand side, which I just put the W, would be Wernicke's area. Just so you, again, place of reference here, and here we're talking about the central sulcus right here in this diagram. So those are the structures that we saw on the previous diagram. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens in the cortex repeating a word that has been heard. So now I basically say a word to you and I'll say the word pencil, and now you repeat the word pencil. So what are the different steps that the brain undergoes? So first, it basically, of course, the sound will basically enter the ear, vibrate on the tympanic membrane. We have vibration of the basilar membrane. And from there, we then get through the auditory nerve, a signal carried, the action potential from the basilar membrane, which is carried to the medial geniculate nucleus, which you know is in the thalamus. We've seen the medial geniculate nucleus in the thalamus. M, remember, M is for medial and M is for music. We're talking about auditory. You're repeating a word that has been heard. This is an auditory reflex, so it goes to the medial geniculate body. From there, the signals are now sent to the primary auditory cortex, which is Brodmann's area, BA41, Brodmann's area 41, which we saw was also on the superior temporal gyrus, which was the middle third of that gyrus. From there, the primary auditory cortex gets now submitted those signals to a higher order auditory cortex, which surrounds the primary auditory cortex, or Brodmann's area 42. So number 2 now is the Brodmann's area 42, where there's a higher deciphering or interpretation of those different sounds. From there, it's carried to area 3 on our diagram here, area 3, which is the parietal association area, which is Brodmann's area 39. So from there, the signal now gets submitted, or we have fibers that connect the parietal association area with Wernicke's area. And now the signal reaches Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is the area where comprehension takes place. So now the comprehension takes place in Wernicke's. Again, Wernicke's is located in the left hemisphere. And from there, there's a signal from Wernicke's. There's an attachment now that I've just drawn in red to Broca's area. So there's a connection between Wernicke's and Broca's area, and that's known as the arcuate fasciculus. So the arcuate fasciculus connects Wernicke's with Broca's. Broca's area, now the signal reaches Broca's area, and Broca's area is again, we said the operculum in the language hemisphere, and Broca's area is where we have the memory for word articulation. This is where you basically now recruit the different muscles required for your auditory output or for the vocalization. So from Broca's area, you basically now recruit the different muscles. And from Broca's, now you activate the different the facial area of the motor cortex, and then those muscles will be recruited, and you can basically say. So those are the different intervening steps for repeating a word that has been heard. Now let's contrast this with naming an object that has been visually recognized. So now we're going to basically name an object. So if I point, obviously you can't see what I have in my hand, but if I had an eraser, or let's say a cell phone, and I lift the cell phone up, and it says, what's in my hand? And reflexively, you recognize it, and here there's no comprehension involved. You're going to name it, and you say cell phone very quickly. So we're talking about this is visually recognized, but there's no comprehension here. So what are the steps now? So now from the retina, we have through cranial nerve 2, signals that go from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus or the lateral geniculate body. You know that the lateral geniculate body is part of the thalamus, and again, L for lateral, L for light. Here we're talking about the visual processing. From the lateral geniculate nucleus, signals now are sent to the primary visual cortex, Brodmann's area 17, and you know from the one of our first lectures that the primary visual cortex is basically in the occipital cortex, mainly the area that the banks of the calcarine sulcus. So on both sides of the calcarine sulcus, we have the primary visual cortex. From the primary visual cortex, the information gets further processed in what we call higher order visual cortex, and here's Brodmann's area 18, which again surround Brodmann's area 17 or the primary visual cortex. This is what basically now will make sense or make us see, let's say, different colors, different shapes. This is where these things are processed at these higher order visual cortices. From there, the information now reaches number 3 on our diagram, the parietal association cortex, and that's Brodmann's 39. And this is sort of a higher order association cortex that receives information from many parts of the brain. From there, now again, there was no comprehension in this example, and now we have the signal that is sent from 3 directly to Broca's area. And then now from Broca's area, we have a signal or activation of the facial motor area, and you can then repeat the word cell phone. So those were the intermediate steps in the whole process of naming an object that has been visually recognized. So now let's talk about Wernicke's aphasia. So here we're talking about Wernicke's aphasia. Now remember, we talked about Wernicke being in the language hemisphere, and we're talking about this area that I'm going to surround right now in the distal third of the superior temporal gyrus. Wernicke's aphasia is also referred to as a receptive or a sensory aphasia. So Wernicke's aphasia is the same thing as what some people refer to as a receptive aphasia or a sensory aphasia. And Wernicke's aphasia is characterized by a prominent deficit in comprehension. And what happens here is that the lesion primarily affects Wernicke's area, which is, we know, in the language hemisphere. So again, this is the left posterior portion of the temporal lobe. So here we have the example here where this area, because of, let's say, an occlusion of a blood vessel, a person has a stroke, and that part of the brain is not perfused, and ultimately there's disruption in the Wernicke's area. When the lesion is extensive, comprehension of both the visual and auditory language input is severely impaired. Patients with Wernicke's aphasia fail to comprehend the ideas that they have in mind, an impairment called empty speech. And since they have a major failure of comprehension, these patients are generally unaware of this failure because language comprehension is impaired in these individuals. So if you were working in a clinical setting with an individual who had a Wernicke's aphasia, and it was Mr. Smith, and you basically said, "Oh, Mr. Smith, where do you live?" The response from Mr. Smith may be, "Oh, I just came from there, I'm going back after." Again, you're saying, no, where do you live? And he might repeat exactly the same thing. So that's what we call empty speech. There's failure to basically convey what information you want from him. Again, you want the address, you want what town, where do you live? And basically they're providing information that is not accurate. That's what we refer to as empty speech. And this is one of the hallmarks of an individual with Wernicke's aphasia. The next type of aphasia is what's called Broca's aphasia. Now, Broca's aphasia is characterized by a loss of language fluency, and Broca's aphasia is where we have a lesion in Broca's area, or here we see the Broca's area in the language hemisphere. And Broca's aphasia is also known as either an expressive or a motor aphasia. So either expressive or motor aphasia. And a Broca's aphasia is characterized by loss of language fluency, albeit with preserved comprehension. So these individuals have an intact Wernicke's area, so comprehension is fine. But where their problem is with verbal output. The recruitment of the different muscles used for articulation is impaired. So these patients have damage to the motor association cortex of the frontal lobe, and that's where we have the Broca's area. The deficit in language production ranges from complete muteness to a slow, deliberate speech constructed from very simple grammatical structures. So there's a paucity of words being used. Patients with Broca's area or Broca's aphasia use only key words. And again, unlike Wernicke's aphasia, these patients are generally aware of these errors. So they realize that they're not saying what they want to say, and they become very flustered because of it. They become very upset because, again, they're trying to use the proper word. They know what they want to say, they just can't say it. So an example here would be, let's say if we had an individual who you see in clinic who has a Broca's aphasia, And for many, many years, let's say he worked in a high-class restaurant where he would invite people to come into the dining hall. And he would basically say, ladies and gentlemen, you're now all invited to come into the dining room, and the dining room would be open and people would go to their meals. Well, after a person with Broca's aphasia would basically now refer, say, ladies, men, eat. So it would be very, very few words, very direct, and again, they would lose that richness of language. So again, although production of language is severely disturbed, comprehension of both spoken and written language is less disturbed because Wernicke's area is intact. So if you are working with this individual and he says, where do you live? He may have trouble, he or she may have trouble, saying Tonawanda or Depew or any area or New York City, but ultimately they would know that that's what they wanted, that's what you wanted from them. So if they couldn't remember, they would get flustered till they could say, and then let's say if you said, oh, I see here on your chart it's Tonawanda, they say, yeah, Tonawanda, then they could repeat it. So that's characterized of a person with Broca's aphasia. We have another aphasia here, which is conduction aphasia. And conduction aphasia is a type of aphasia where we have damage to the arcuate fasciculus. And remember, we said that those fibers, the arcuate fasciculus, connected the Wernicke's areas with Broca's areas. So in this type of an aphasia, we have a lesion where there's disruption in those fibers connecting Wernicke's to Broca's. So like patients with Wernicke's aphasia, these patients are fluent, so the verbal output is perfect because Broca's area is intact, but they have many paraphrasic errors, errors in which incorrect words are substituted for correct ones. So they often misuse the words. Damage to the arcuate fasciculus impairs the ability to repeat. So they would have a major problem here repeating a certain word. In these patients, reading aloud is abnormal, but patients can read silently with good comprehension. So again, they could be able to read to a book, but if you ask them, could you read aloud, they would have major problems. So that's conduction aphasia. Global aphasia now. Global aphasia results from a lesion of the entire perisylvian region. And here, if we talked about the lateral sulcus, and we said another term earlier was the sylvian sulcus, and this is a complete lesion affecting this whole area between Wernicke's and Broca's. So this would be a lesion affecting this whole area here, the entire perisylvian area. And what happened here is, so both Broca's and Wernicke's area are compromised, as is the arcuate fasciculus. Patients with global aphasia are unable to speak or comprehend language. These patients cannot read, write, repeat, or name objects, so there's a severe disability here. Symptoms also include a complete right hemiplasia and right sensory deficit. So again, this is a fairly significant loss of function. Again, in the left hemisphere, where again we have Wernicke's and Broca's, and the entire area between those two that are affected. And then one last one, I'd like to talk about the aprosodias. So the aprosodias, what do we mean by the aprosodias? These are disturbances in the affective components of language associated with damage to the non-language hemisphere. So now we're talking about damage to the right, not to the language hemisphere, but to the non-language hemisphere. And what occurs, or what's happening now in the non-language hemisphere? We saw earlier that comprehension takes place in Wernicke's. So your ability to comprehend the difference between yes and no takes place in Wernicke's area, area B here. Broca's is where you have the ability to say yes or no, is in the language hemisphere. But what's happening now in those areas? Now, we do not call them Wernicke's and we do not call them Broca's in the non-language hemisphere, but they do have anatomical correlates in those hemispheres. Well, in the area that is akin to Wernicke's, even though we don't call it Wernicke's, in the non-language hemisphere, this is where we have comprehension of the affective components of speech. Your comprehension of the difference when a person says, you ask a question and the person sort of chuckles, says no versus no. there's a difference in the emotional content of language, and this is where the actual comprehension takes place in this area in the right hemisphere. So a person with a lesion in this area here in the non-language hemisphere, D, would have an inability to differentiate between no, I'm not interested, between no, I'm not interested. They would lose that ability. Now what's happening in this area, the operculum in the non-language hemisphere? And here we can basically go to area C, the non-language hemisphere, the operculum. Well, we know that Broca's area is where it's the output, the verbal output, the ability to differentiate or to say the difference between yes and no. Well, in the non-language hemisphere, area C now, in the non-language area, the operculum in the non-language hemisphere, is where your ability to say that the output, yet again, the emotional output. So here we're talking about output and the ability to have an emotional output of your language, to yes, the difference between yes versus yes, or no and no. That output occurs in the non-language hemisphere. So even though language is predominantly in most of us in the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is also participating in the richness of language during these. So it's participating, and again, this is because of fibers or connections through the corpus callosum connecting the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And then finally here, I have this characteristics of major aphasias. And here you can see this table here where we have Broca's aphasia, we have Wernicke's aphasia, and we have conduction aphasia. And again, these all occur in the language hemisphere. Verbal output, so the ability for a person to speak. In a Broca's aphasia, because it affects, again, Broca's area, there's a non-fluent output, versus in a Wernicke's area or conduction, the output is fluent. Now again, remember in Wernicke's, there's empty speech. So the person basically may not have you might not be able to understand, or they lose the richness of the language, but nevertheless they're fluent. They can speak. Would be like listening to somebody who spoke a foreign language that you did not understand. You can tell, you can't understand what that person's saying, but you know that they're being fluent in their output. Next, we have repetition. Repetition, repeating a word that has been heard, is impaired in all three of these cases. As far as the comprehension, in Broca's aphasia, it's normal. In Wernicke's aphasia, it's impaired. And in conduction aphasia, it's normal. And then finally, naming an object that has been visually seen. So again, the ability to repeat. In Broca's aphasia, it could be marginally impaired, just because of, again, an inability to recruit the proper muscles of articulation, so they would have major problems maybe repeating, but it's just marginally impaired. As far as Wernicke's and conduction aphasia, those would be impaired much more severely than in a Broca's aphasia. So these are the characteristics of the major aphasias that we would see. So this is the end of the language video. Again, hopefully that we've correlated some of the structures that we've seen this semester with their overall functional components.